high within the dusty and forgotten attic of a crumbling brick building, sits a massive collection of objects that time seemingly forgot. These are not mere pieces of luggage, but vessels of lost souls left behind by the thousands of people who entered the gates of Willard Asylum, never to return to the outside world. The air in this expansive attic is thick with the heavy scent of decaying leather and old paper, while dust motes dance in shafts of pale light cutting through the gloom. Each suitcase represents a life interrupted, a story cut short, and a name that was slowly erased from the collective memory of society. It is said that if you stand silently among the stacks of luggage, you can hear the faint whispers of the owners pleading to be remembered. The Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane opened its doors in the year 1869 on the eastern shore of Seneca Lake in New York State. It was created with a specific purpose that chills the blood of modern observers, as it was designed for those deemed incurable. Unlike other institutions that sought to rehabilitate patients, Willard was built as a final destination, a place where the unwanted and the broken were sent to live out their remaining days in isolation. The Victorian era architecture stands tall and imposing against the gray skyline, a fortress of brick and stone intended to separate the madness inside from the sanity of the world outside. For over a century, this place absorbed the lives of more than 50,000 individuals as the iron gates swung open to admit new patients. A heavy sense of finality descended upon them like a leaden shroud. Doctors and families alike viewed admission to Willard not as a step toward recovery, but as a form of social burial. The patients arrived by steamboat, and train clutching their worldly possessions in the very suitcases that now rot in the attic. They brought with them photographs of loved ones' Bibles with worn pages and handmade quilts that smelled of home. These items were confiscated and stored away, promised to be returned upon discharge, a day that, for the vast majority, would never come. The click of the lock on a suitcase was often the last sound of freedom a patient would ever hear. Among the thousands who walked these halls was a young woman named Madeline, who arrived in the late 19th century with eyes full of fear. She had been committed by a husband who found her melancholic moods inconvenient and her spirit too difficult to tame. Madeline spent her days staring out of the barred windows at the shimmering waters of Seneca, like watching the boats pass by like ghosts in the mist. The staff described her as quiet and withdrawn, but the other patients whispered that she spoke to people who were not there. At night, her weeping echoed through the cold stone corridors, a mournful sound that mingled with the wind howling off the lake. The daily routine at Willard was rigid and unforgiving, designed to keep order among the chaos of thousands of troubled minds. Patients were roused before dawn and set to work in the laundry rooms, the kitchens, or the vast farm fields that surrounded the asylum. The philosophy of the time believed that hard labor was a distraction from insanity. But for many, it was simply a grueling march toward the grave. Men with calloused hands worked the earth until their backs broke, while women scrubbed floors until their knees were raw. In the dining halls, hundreds of spoons clattered against metal bowls in a cacophony that sounded like the rattling of bones. Winter at the asylum brought a special kind of torment, as the biting winds from the lake seeped through the cracks in the masonry. The heating systems were often inadequate, leaving the wards shivering in a damp chill that settled deep into the marrow. It was during these long, dark months that the mortality rate would climb, and the cemetery crews would be kept busy hacking at the frozen ground. Death became a constant companion in the wards, a silent nurse making rounds from bed to bed. When a patient passed away, there was no elaborate funeral, only a simple pine box and a nameless marker in the asylum graveyard. One particularly harsh winter in the early 20th century, a localized flu epidemic swept through the crowded wards like a wildfire. The infirmary overflowed with the sick, and the dying, their feverish cries merging into a single continuous wail of suffering. Nurses and orderlies struggled to keep up with the demand for care, but the sheer volume of tragedy was overwhelming. It is said that the spirits of those who died during this dark period were so numerous that they could not move on, trapped within the walls where they took their last breath. Staff reported seeing shadowy figures moving at the foot of beds and feeling cold hands grasping their wrists. There was a patient named Lawrence who worked as a gravedigger for the institution for 40 years. He took great pride in his work, meticulously digging the graves for his fellow inmates who had passed on into the void. Lawrence knew that he too would one day end up in the very soil he turned, but he found a grim comfort in the cycle of earth to earth. He claimed that the dead spoke to him as he worked, telling him their true names and the stories that the doctors had ignored. He would often be seen nodding and murmuring to empty air, pausing his shovel to listen to the unseen voices. The overcrowding at Willard eventually reached a breaking point as the population swelled far beyond the intended capacity of the buildings. Beds were crammed into corridors and day rooms, destroying any semblance of privacy or dignity for the residents. The noise level was deafening, a constant roar of shouting, crying, and manic laughter that never truly ceased, even in the dead of night. In this pressure cooker of humanity, tension snapped, and violence occasionally erupted, leaving blood on the pristine tile floors. The overwhelmed staff resorted to stricter measures, utilizing restraints and isolation rooms that were little more than stone cells. Deep in the basement of the main building were the seclusion cells, places of absolute darkness, where the most unruly patients were kept. These small, windowless rooms were damp and smelled of mold and misery. Scratches on the back of the heavy wooden doors told the frantic tales of those who had tried to claw their way out. Legend has it that a man named Elias was locked in one of these cells and forgotten for 3 days during a shift change error. When they finally opened the door, Elias was gone, but the room was filled with a thick, freezing fog that chilled the guards to the bone. Treatments in the early days of the asylum were experimental and often crossed the line into what modern minds would consider torture. Hydrotherapy involved submerging patients in ice-cold water for hours to shock them out of their hysteria or calm their nerves. Others were strapped into spinning chairs or subjected to early forms of electroshock therapy that left them dazed and memoryless. The screams that emanated from the treatment wings were enough to make even the hardened orderlies shudder. These traumatic energies soaked into the very fabric of the building, creating a reservoir of pain that lingers to this day. As the decades rolled on, the suitcase collection in the attic continued to grow, a mounting pile of forgotten legacies. Every time a patient died and was unclaimed by family, their belongings were boxed up and carried up the narrow stairs. Over time, the attic became a city of luggage, a necropolis of leather and tweed. Dust settled in thick gray blankets over the trunks, sealing them like tombs. The sheer number of cases is a testament to the isolation these people faced, rejected by their kin and erased from the family tree. A nurse who worked the night shift in the 1940s reported a terrifying encounter on the 3rd floor of the women's wing. She was making her rounds, checking on the sleeping patients, when she saw a woman standing at the end of the hallway wearing a dress from the Victorian era. The figure was translucent and glowed with a faint, sickly light. As the nurse approached, the figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was devoid of features, a smooth, blank surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. The nurse fled in terror and refused to ever work on that floor again. The asylum also housed the criminally insane for a period, creating a volatile mix of the vulnerable and the dangerous. Security was tightened, and the atmosphere grew even more oppressive with the addition of guards and heavier locks. Stories circulated of a patient known only as the Butcher, who had been committed after a gruesome crime in New York City. Even the other patients gave him a wide berth, sensing the predatory darkness that radiated from him. It is whispered that his spirit still stalks the lower levels of the building, an aggressive shadow that pushes visitors and scratches at the walls. In the 1950s, the introduction of psychotropic medications changed the landscape of mental health care forever. The halls of Willard became quieter as the chemical restraints replaced the physical ones. Patients shuffled through the corridors in a medicated haze, their eyes glazed and their movements sluggish. While the screaming stopped, a new kind of horror emerged, the horror of the empty shell. The souls of the patients seemed to retreat deep inside their bodies, leaving only a hollow vessel to wander the asylum grounds. The silence was somehow more unnerving than the noise had been. Despite the changes, the stigma of Willard remained a dark cloud over the region. Local children dared each other to run up to the gates, but few had the courage to stay long. The locals spoke of strange lights flickering in the abandoned wings, and the sound of a phantom piano playing sad, discordant melodies in the middle of the night. It was widely believed that the ground itself was sour tainted by the misery of thousands of wasted lives. The very soil seemed to reject life, with the gardens around the main building struggling to grow anything but weeds. By the 1990s, the movement toward deinstitutionalization led to the gradual closure of massive facilities like Willard. The patients were moved to smaller community-based homes or released entirely. As the wards emptied, the buildings fell silent for the first time in over a century. But the emptiness felt heavy charged with the static of 1,000 unheard conversations. The staff who remained to oversee the closure reported feeling watched constantly, as if the building itself was mourning the loss of its inhabitants. Doors would slam shut on their own, and lights would flicker violently without cause. When the doors finally locked for the last time in 1995, the asylum was left to the elements and the ghosts. However, it was not completely empty, for the attic still held its treasure trove of suitcases. It was only later that a museum curator and a photographer gained access and discovered the magnitude of what had been left behind. Opening the suitcases was like opening a portal to the past. They found pristine, untouched items that dated back to the Civil War era, perfectly preserved in the darkness. It was a time capsule of sorrow. Among the items found in the suitcases were letters that had never been mailed, written by patients begging their families to come and take them home. The ink was faded, but the desperation in the handwriting was as sharp as the day it was written. Reading these letters brings tears to the eyes of even the most stoic researchers. They tell of confusion, fear, and a deep, abiding loneliness that span decades. These unmailed letters are perhaps the most haunting artifacts of all, proof that their voices were silenced not just by death, but by the institution itself. One suitcase belonged to a woman named Irma, who had been a highly educated schoolteacher before her commitment. Inside her case were books on philosophy and poetry, along with a diary detailing her descent into despair. Her final entry simply read, "I am becoming part of the walls." Researchers who handled Irma's belongings reported a sudden drop in temperature and the overwhelming smell of lavender perfume. It is believed that Irma's spirit is one of the many that refuses to leave the attic, guarding her intellectual treasures for eternity. The cemetery at Willard is a vast field of simple metal markers, mostly bearing only numbers rather than names. Over 5,700 people are buried there in anonymous graves. This lack of identity in death is the final insult to those who lived their lives as numbers on a chart. In recent years, there has been an effort to match the numbers to the names to give dignity back to the forgotten. But locals say that on foggy nights, you can see thousands of faint lights hovering over the field, seeking the recognition they were denied in life. Paranormal investigators who have ventured into the abandoned buildings of Willard report extreme levels of activity. Electronic voice phenomena recordings have captured voices saying, "Get out and help me." Shadow figures are commonly seen darting between the peeling paint of the hallway walls. One investigator claimed to have been physically pushed down a flight of stairs by an unseen force. The energy in the building is described as heavy and aggressive, a swirling vortex of confusion and anger that has had nowhere to go for 100 years. The morgue of the asylum remains one of the most chilling locations on the entire campus. The stainless steel tables and the cold storage drawers are still there gathering dust. Visitors to this room often report sudden nausea and the feeling of being choked. It is easy to imagine the bodies that passed through here, the final stop before the anonymous grave. The air in the morgue feels stagnant and dead, as if time itself has stopped. Some say the spirits of those who died on the tables linger there confused and waiting for a release that never comes. In the children's ward, the atmosphere shifts from aggressive to heartbreakingly sad. Toys were found scattered among the debris, mute witnesses to the little lives that were spent behind bars. The sound of a child giggling has been heard by security guards patrolling the perimeter. A small rocking horse was seen rocking on its own in a room where the air was perfectly still. The spirits of the children seem to be trapped in a perpetual state of play, unaware that the world has moved on without them. The sheer scale of the suffering at Willard creates a psychic imprint that is impossible to ignore. It is not just a haunted house, it is a haunted city. The emotional residue of 50,000 people living in distress has saturated the brick and mortar. Sensitive individuals often cannot bear to be on the grounds for more than a few minutes before being overcome with grief. It is a place where the barrier between the living and the dead is paper thin, worn down by a century of tears. There is a particular room on the 4th floor that the staff used to call the crying room. It was here that patients were often brought to calm down after an episode. Legend says that if you stand in the center of the room and close your eyes, you can feel the sensation of wet tears running down your own cheeks, even if you are not crying. It is as if the room itself is weeping, releasing the sorrow that was absorbed into the plaster walls. This phenomenon has unnerved many skeptics who came looking for ghosts and found only overwhelming sadness. The legacy of the Willard suitcases has sparked a global interest in the lives of the patients. Exhibitions of the luggage have traveled to museums, allowing the public to see the faces of the forgotten. But with this exposure comes a disturbance of the peace. Some believe that by opening the suitcases and displaying the personal items, we are disturbing the spirits attached to them. There have been reports of strange occurrences at the exhibitions, lights flickering and objects moving inside locked display cases. One particularly disturbing story involves a security guard who patrolled the building during its final days of operation. He reported seeing a full spectral procession of patients walking down the main corridor at 3 in the morning. They were dressed in gray asylum uniforms and walked in perfect unison, their footsteps making no sound. The guard watched in paralysis as the procession walked straight through a solid brick wall and vanished. He resigned the next morning, unable to reconcile what he had seen with his understanding of reality. The dilapidated state of the buildings today adds to the horror of the sight. Ceilings have collapsed, floors are rotting, and nature is slowly reclaiming the structure. Vines creep through the broken windows like green fingers reaching for the secrets inside. Yet despite the decay, the atmosphere of dread remains potent. The peeling paint looks like shedding skin, and the rusted metal fixtures look like torture devices. The ruin is a physical manifestation of the broken minds that once inhabited it. As night falls over Seneca, like the silhouette of Willard Asylum stands as a dark monument to a tragic past. The wind whistles through the broken panes, creating a mournful song that travels across the water. Fishermen on the lake avoid the shoreline near the asylum, claiming that the water there is always unnaturally cold, and the fish never bite. They say that on quiet nights you can hear the sound of thousands of voices chanting in a low hum, a sound that vibrates in your chest. The spirits of Willard are not malevolent in the traditional sense, but they are desperate. They are the spirits of people who were ignored in life, and they refuse to be ignored in death. They bang on the pipes, they slam doors, and they whisper in the ears of trespassers. They are demanding the acknowledgement that was stolen from them by a system that treated them as problems to be solved rather than human beings to be healed. Their energy is a collective scream for validation. Today, the Willard Asylum complex stands mostly empty, a ghost town of red brick and ivy. Plans for renovation or demolition are constantly debated, but the buildings seem to resist change. Construction workers have refused to work on the site, citing an oppressive feeling of dread. It is as if the asylum wants to remain, standing a permanent scar on the landscape to remind the world of what happened there. The suitcases in the attic have been removed, but the heaviness remains. The story of Willard is not just a ghost story. It is a history of how society treats its most vulnerable members. The ghosts that haunt these halls are the manifestations of our collective guilt. They are the reminders of the people we locked away and tried to forget. As long as the buildings stand, the spirits will remain bound to the place where their lives were effectively ended. They are the eternal patience of Willard, waiting for a discharge that will never be granted. If you ever find yourself near the eastern shore of Seneca Lake, and you see the looming towers of the old asylum, do not stop. Keep driving, and do not look into the dark windows, for if you look too closely, you might see a face looking back at you. A pale, featureless face pressing against the glass. And if you listen too closely to the wind, you might hear your own name being whispered by 40,000 voices begging you to take them home. The tragedy of the Willard Asylum is that the horror did not end when the patients died. It continues in the silence of the unmarked graves and the darkness of the empty wards. The suitcases may have been opened, but the stories are far from finished. The energy of the place is a loop of suffering that replays over and over again. And as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, the asylum comes alive, once more filled with the memories of the forgotten. Ultimately, the Willard Asylum serves as a grim warning from history. It stands as a testament to the fact that buildings can hold memories, and that sorrow can stain the earth. The 40,000 souls who passed through those gates are still there in one form or another. They are the dust in the attic, the cold spot in the hallway, and the whisper in the dark. They are the forgotten, and they will never let us forget them.